The moment they laughed, I knew we were at war. Not the kind of war with a date and a declaration. Not the kind that starts with fire and ends with headlines. I mean the slow, quiet kind that begins inside a man's chest when he realizes that the people sitting across from him do not see him as a person at all. My name is Yusuf Mara. I was 43 years old when I walked into the Galactic Council chamber for the first time, and I was a different man by the time I walked out. The chamber was enormous. That is the only word for it. It sat inside a station called the Concord Ring, a structure so large that it had its own weather near the upper levels. The walls curved upward in sweeping arcs of white and gold, and the seating tiers rose in perfect circles from a central floor where representatives stood to speak. There were 41 species represented inside that room, beings of every shape, color, and biology, each seated behind a desk bearing their world symbol, each connected to a translation network that fed real-time audio into small receivers worn at the ear, or pressed to the skin, or held in whatever appendage a given species used for such things. I found Earth's station at the back, not near the back, not toward the back, at the back, the farthest row from the central floor, tucked between a support pillar and a cooling duct that hummed with a low, constant vibration. The desk was standard issue, the same modular unit shipped to every new observer species, and 2 of its display panels were flickering. There was no translation staff waiting for me. No welcome packet, no liaison officer, just a small printed card on the desk that read, Non-voting observer, Tier 0, Sol System Earth. My aide, a young man named Oliver Grant, stood beside me and said nothing. He was 26 sharp and had studied the Council's procedural code for 3 years before this posting. He looked at the seat and then looked at me, and I could see him calculating how to say something without saying it. Sit down, Oliver, I said. He sat. I sat. We watched the chamber fill. The Vethkai arrived last, as they always did. Ceremonial timing. Their delegation was 12 strong, led by a being called High Consul Arath, who moved with the unhurried ease of something that had never been afraid of anything in its life. The Vethkai were tall, pale blue, with elongated skulls and eyes the color of copper. They had been the dominant species in the Council for over 300 years. Their technology was extraordinary. Their culture was ancient. Their opinion of humanity was, as I was about to learn, roughly equivalent to the opinion a professor might hold of a first-year student who had shown up to the wrong classroom. The session opened with a recitation of Council principles: unity, progress, shared stewardship of the galaxy. I listened through my translation receiver and took notes. Oliver had his tablet out and was logging everything. Then came the introductions. When a new species joined the Council as an observer, there was a formal introduction delivered by the incumbent chair, who that cycle happened to be Arath himself. He rose from his seat, walked to the central floor with that slow, theatrical grace of his, and addressed the chamber. We welcome, he said, and the translation came through as a smooth, almost musical voice, the representatives of the Sol System, planet Earth, a juvenile world, currently pre-tier classification, notable in the galactic record primarily for their species' remarkable talent for internal conflict and their as yet unresolved tendency toward self-destruction. Something moved through the chamber. A sound. I did not recognize it at first. Then I did. It was laughter. 31 species, each expressing amusement in their own way. Some with sound, some with posture, some with bioluminescent flickers along their skin. A ripple of gentle collective mockery aimed at the back row where 2 humans sat behind a flickering desk. Oliver's hand was very still on his tablet. I kept my face neutral. I had spent 20 years in diplomacy. I knew how to be neutral. But I noted the laughter the way a doctor notes a symptom, quietly, carefully, with full awareness of what it meant. Arath returned to his seat. The session moved on to its primary agenda, the Resource Partitioning Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that divided access rights to 11 star systems across 4 sectors. 3 of those systems had been charted by human deep space probes. We had filed the discovery records with the Council Registry ourselves, 18 months before our observer status was granted. The Act awarded those systems to Vethkai-aligned collectives. I raised my hand to speak. The chair acknowledged me with a gesture that, I later learned, was the Vethkai equivalent of a polite dismissal. My microphone activated for exactly 90 seconds. I said, clearly and calmly, that Earth had prior discovery records for 3 of the systems in question. I said that we respectfully requested either co-access rights or a delay in the vote pending legal review. Arath looked at me the way a man looks at a child who has interrupted an adult conversation. Observer status, he said, does not confer voting rights, nor does it grant standing to contest active legislation. Your discovery records have been noted in the archive. Will they be considered? I asked. They have been noted, he repeated. The vote was called. 31 in favor, 0 against. Earth did not have a vote to cast. After the session ended, I filed a formal protest through the council's administrative office. The officer at the desk, a small gray-skinned being with 4 eyes, typed something into his terminal without looking up and told me the protest had been received. "Which committee reviews it?" I asked. He pulled up a menu on his screen, scrolled for a moment, and said, "Non-voting observer grievances tier 0. When does that committee meet?" He looked at me then, just for a second. Something passed across his face that I could not quite name. Not cruelty, more like pity. "That committee has not convened in 47 years, he said. Oliver and I walked back to our quarters in silence. The Concord Ring had long, clean corridors lit by soft white panels, and the air smelled faintly of something like pine, the environmental system set to a scent considered neutral across species. I walked the whole length of that corridor saying nothing, feeling the laughter still sitting in my chest like a stone. In my quarters, I sat at the small communications terminal, entered the encryption sequence that connected me directly to the office of Director Nadia Okoro at Earth's Interstellar Affairs Bureau, and typed a message. I did not write it in diplomatic language. I did not file it through official channels. I sent it on a private frequency, using a personal key that Nadia and I had agreed on before I left Earth. The message was 7 words. "They do not fear us. Start preparing." I sat back in my chair after I sent it. Outside the small porthole in my quarters, the stars were absolutely still. Billions of them, silent and cold and indifferent. I had looked at those stars all my life and felt wonder. That night, for the first time, I looked at them and felt something else entirely. I thought about my father, who had been a civil engineer in Lagos. He used to say that the most dangerous thing in any negotiation was not the opponent who threatened you, it's the opponent who forgot to take you seriously. I thought about that for a long time. Then I opened my notebook and began to write down everything I had seen that day. Every word, every gesture, every procedural detail. Not as a grievance, not as a complaint, as intelligence, because that is what it was. The Vethkai had just handed me a full picture of how they thought, what they valued, where they were careless, and most importantly, what they had chosen not to learn about the species sitting at the back of the room, behind 2 flickering display panels. They had laughed. They had looked at humanity, 400 years of space travel, 2 world wars survived, a civilization that had pulled itself back from the edge of collapse more times than any other species in that chamber had ever faced a serious threat, and they had laughed. I wrote for 2 hours. Oliver brought me tea at some point and sat quietly in the corner, reading his procedural code, and neither of us spoke, and the hum of the cooling duct vibrated gently through the wall, and I kept writing. When I finally stopped, I had 32 pages. I read them over once. Then I encrypted the document, added it to the transmission I had already sent to Nadia, and flagged it with a single word in the header field. The word was, everything. I did not sleep that night. Not from anger. Anger is a fire, and fires burn out. What kept me awake was clarity, the kind that comes only when you finally understand the full shape of the problem in front of you. The Galactic Council was not a place of equals pretending to be equals. It was a hierarchy pretending to be a forum. Humanity had been admitted not because the Council wanted us there, but because excluding a spacefaring species from the Council carried its own political costs. And observer status was the most elegant solution. Give them a seat, give them no power, let them watch, let them learn their place. And for 47 years, since the committee that handled our kind of complaint had last bothered to meet, not a single Tier 0 species had managed to change that. I intended to be the second thing that kept me awake. The question of whether humanity would become the first, or whether we would simply become another quiet, polite entry in the archive. I already knew the answer. I had known it the moment I heard the laughter. We would not be quiet. We had never been quiet. That was perhaps our greatest flaw, and the thing that had kept us alive for every brutal century of our existence. I closed my notebook. I turned off the light. I lay in the dark and listened to the hum of the Concord Ring around me, and I thought about what came next. And I was, despite everything, absolutely certain that the Vethkai had made the single most consequential mistake in the 300 years of their dominance. They had forgotten to be afraid. The broadcast reached Concord Ring 14 days after the first session. I was eating breakfast with Oliver when he turned his tablet toward me without a word. On the screen was a Vethkai cultural program. Something between a news segment and entertainment, the kind of thing that aired across their home networks and was automatically distributed to all council members as part of a cultural exchange agreement. The exchange agreement had been written, naturally, by the Vethkai. The segment was called, according to the translation, Young Worlds, Young Minds. It was a short documentary about humanity. It used footage gathered from Earth's own public archives and from observation data filed with the Council. It showed our cities, our traffic, our hospitals, our schools, our farms. It showed historical records of our conflicts. It lingered on those. The narrator's voice was pleasant and informative, the way a nature documentary narrator sounds when describing an animal that has not yet learned to avoid predators. The humans of Sol 3, the narrator said, represent a fascinating case study in a species that has survived primarily through aggression and adaptability rather than intelligence or cooperation. Their average lifespan is brief by galactic standards. Their bodies are fragile and susceptible to temperature, pressure, and biological agents. They have spent the majority of their recorded history in conflict with one another, and only in the last 4 centuries have they achieved the basic technological threshold required for consideration as an observer species. There was a pause, and then, with what I can only describe as precisely calibrated warmth, the narrator added, "It is hoped that with patience and proper guidance, they may one day develop the maturity required to contribute meaningfully to galactic society." The segment ran for 11 minutes. I watched all of it. Oliver watched me the entire time. When it ended, I set down my fork, wiped my mouth with a napkin, and said, "Log it." "Already done," Oliver said. "Add it to the file I sent Nadia." "Done. And send a copy to Colonel Adaze Bright at the Earth Defense Compact with a note that says the timeline should be accelerated." Oliver looked up. "Should I say why?" "She will know why," I said. I finished my breakfast. The food was a standard council provision meal. Bland and nutritionally correct, and completely loveless, and I ate every bite of it because I had learned a long time ago that you ate when you could, regardless of your mood, because you never knew when the next meal would be interrupted. Across the station, the broadcast was playing in lounges and common areas and delegate offices, and in every place it played, beings of 31 species were watching it, and many of them were finding it amusing, and none of them were thinking about what it meant to show a species that it was not respected. None of them had ever needed to think about that. They had evolved in conditions that, compared to Earth, were almost painfully stable. Most of the species in that council had never experienced a mass extinction event. Several had never experienced a war. The Vethkai themselves had achieved planetary unity in a single generation, a smooth and celebrated transition, guided by a philosopher leader whose name was carved into the station's entrance wall. They had no framework for what they were looking at when they looked at us. My father used to take me to the coast when I was a boy. We would stand at the water's edge and he would point at the rocks and say, "Yusuf, do you know what made the ocean?" And I would say the ocean, and he would say pressure, time, and the ocean never stopping. Not once, in a billion years, stopping. That was what the Vethkai did not understand about Earth. We had never stopped. Every catastrophe that had come for us had found a species that refused to lie down. We had buried our dead, rebuilt our cities, rewritten our laws, and gone back out into the world with more knowledge than we had before. We had been forced by circumstance to develop a relationship with suffering that no stable, comfortable civilization could ever fully comprehend. We knew pain. We knew loss. We knew the particular kind of determination that only comes from having genuinely nothing left to lose. And we had taken all of that and built something with it. The Earth Defense Compact had been established quietly, 6 months before my first council session. Not as a response to the council, not officially, but every person in the room when it was founded knew exactly what it was a response to. Nadia had brought together the heads of Earth's major space programs, the commanders of the existing orbital and deep space defense networks, and a small group of strategic analysts who had spent the previous decade studying conflict patterns across every galactic civilization they could access records on. What they built was not elegant. It was not the kind of thing you would make a broadcast about. There were no gleaming hulls or ceremonial colors. The EDC fleet looked like what it was. Ships designed by engineers who had read every account of every space engagement in recorded galactic history and had drawn a single consistent conclusion. Beautiful ships lost fights. Ships with redundancies won them. The flagship was called the Ardmore. It was not sleek. It was wide, heavily armored, and bristling with point defense systems along every angle of approach. It had been designed to take damage and keep functioning. It had been designed to think about what happened after the first shot landed, which was something most galactic warships, built for deterrence and display, had apparently never fully considered. Adaze had sent me a brief of the Ardmore's specifications 2 weeks before the council session. I had read it on the transport ship on the way to Concord Ring, sitting in my small cabin with a cup of cold coffee and a growing sense that humanity was not quite as defenseless as the council assumed. The brief was 70 pages long. I read every one. What struck me was not the weapons, although the weapons were considerable. What struck me was the doctrine. The EDC had built its entire tactical framework around a concept they called sustained asymmetric pressure, which was a formal name for something humans had been doing instinctively for 10,000 years. You did not fight the opponent who was stronger than you on their terms. You changed the terms. You made the fight expensive. You made it long. You made it exhausting in ways the enemy had not prepared for, because you had prepared for exhaustion your entire life and they had not. I folded the brief and put it in my bag and looked out the cabin window at the stars and thought, we are not who they think we are. Now, sitting in the council station 14 days into my posting, watching a broadcast that presented my species as a charming curiosity, I was thinking the same thing again. The difference was that now I was also thinking about timing. 3 days after the broadcast, I received a response from Nadia. It was 3 lines. Campact notified. Ardmore Group operational. Awaiting your signal. I read it twice. Then I deleted it from the terminal and went to the session. That session was the one where the Vethkai tabled the motion on protectorate classification. The motion was long and carefully worded. It described Earth as a developing civilization that would benefit from structured guidance and oversight. It outlined a framework by which a senior council species would assume administrative responsibility for Earth's development, providing resources, education, and protection, in exchange for coordinating Earth's policy positions through an approved council liaison. In plain language, it meant that Earth would no longer make its own decisions. They called it the Stewardship Protocol. The translation was smooth and gracious, and entirely without menace. The people who wrote it had never to think about how words like stewardship and guidance and protection sounded to a species that had fought for every inch of its own sovereignty since before written language existed. The debate lasted 4 hours. I was given 90 seconds, same as before. I used them carefully. I did not raise my voice. I did not make threats. I said, with complete precision, that the protocol was a violation of sovereign autonomy, that Earth had neither requested nor required external administration, and that the passage of this motion without Earth's consent would be noted in our permanent record as a coercive act. Aerith looked at me from his seat with that same expression, polite, unmoved, certain. The vote was 31 in favor, 1 against. I sat down. Oliver was very still beside me. After the session, in the corridor, he finally said it. What do we do? I had already written the message in my head. I typed it out when I got back to my quarters, encrypted it, and sent it. It was 1 word longer than the last one. They have voted for protectorate status. Send the Ardmore Group. Do not fire first, but do not wait long. I sent it. I sat back. I looked at the stars. Then I opened my notebook and started a new page. At the top I wrote a single line that I had been carrying in my mind since the first session. Every species in that chamber had evolved in paradise. We had not. And that, in the end, was going to be the difference. The Vethkai administrative fleet arrived in the Sol system on a Tuesday. I know that detail because Oliver told me afterward, and because it struck me as exactly the kind of thing that would happen. A Tuesday. A perfectly ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day on which civilizations apparently decided to send fleets to other people's home systems to install oversight commissions. I was not on Earth when it happened. I was still on the Concord ring, still sitting at my flickering desk in the back row, still wearing my translation receiver and attending sessions and filing protests that went into folders that no one opened. That was where the council needed me to be, and Nadia and I had agreed that my presence at the ring was more valuable than my presence at home. I was watching. I was recording. I was keeping my face completely neutral every single day, but I was connected. The moment the fleet's transponders appeared on Earth's long-range scan network, I received a quiet alert on my personal device, a single pulse, the agreed signal. They were there. The Vethkai fleet was 12 vessels, all administrative class, which in Vethkai terms meant large, well-equipped, and visually imposing. They had gleaming hulls. They had broadcast arrays powerful enough to transmit across the entire inner system. They came in at a steady, unhurried pace, broadcasting on open frequencies from the moment they crossed the outer marker. The broadcast was a formal announcement. They were the Stewardship Implementation Command, authorized by the Galactic Council's 31st session, arriving to establish Earth's Protectorate Oversight Commission, and to begin the process of coordinating Earth's administrative integration into the Council framework. The broadcast was warm, helpful, completely certain of its welcome. They received no response for 4 hours. 4 hours of silence while 12 ships moved at their steady, ceremonial pace through the outer system, broadcasting their friendly announcements to a planet that was not answering. I can imagine the bridge of the lead vessel during those 4 hours. The commander, a Vethkai official named Magistrate Orvith, apparently sent 3 follow-up signals, each slightly more direct than the last. No answer. Then Earth answered. It was not a voice transmission. It was a data packet, formally structured, legally referenced, bearing the official seal of the Earth Sovereign Council and the signatures of every sitting head of government. It was a document titled The Declaration of Sovereign Integrity, and it ran to 11 pages, and every single page was a carefully constructed, meticulously cited argument for why the Stewardship Protocol had no standing under any reasonable interpretation of pre-existing galactic law. Oliver had helped me write it over 3 long nights at the back of the chamber. We had pulled every relevant legal precedent from the Council archive, every prior case where observer status had been converted to protectorate status, and every case where such conversions had later been challenged. We had built an argument that was airtight, patient, and absolutely clear. The last line of the document read, "Earth will not accept external administration. This position is final." Attached to that document, in the same data packet, was a second file. The second file contained targeting solutions for all 12 Vethkai vessels. Not a threat. Not warnings. Targeting solutions, precise, calculated, prepared, showing every identified weak point in every hull, every angle, every system. It was the product of months of analysis by EGC intelligence teams who had spent a great deal of time reviewing everything publicly available about Vethkai vessel architecture, and a little additional time reviewing things that were not so publicly available. It was a message that needed no translation. Magistrate Orvith stopped the fleet. I know this because of the alert sequence on my device. A second, pulse different room. They had halted. There was a tense period after that. 6 hours where nothing moved, where 2 fleets sat in the same system, and every communication was logged and measured and weighed. Orvith sent a transmission to the Council. Aerith sent a transmission to Earth. Earth sent Aerith back a copy of the Declaration of Sovereign Integrity, with a brief note that said the document had been lodged with the Council archive under permanent legal record. Then Orvith made the choice that ended any remaining possibility of a quiet resolution. He ordered the fleet to continue toward Earth. He had decided it was a bluff. I received the alert the moment the fleet began moving again. By then it was late in the station's evening cycle, and I was sitting on my bunk in my quarters with my notebook. And when the alert came, I put the notebook down and picked up the communication device and typed a very short message to Adeze. "They are advancing. You have authorization." Colonel Adeze Bright was not the kind of person who needed preparation time. The Ardmore group had been at full readiness since the fleet appeared on long-range scan. Adeze had been sitting in the command center of the Ardmore for 6 hours, calm and completely ready, with her targeting teams briefed and her crew at stations. What happened next took 11 minutes. The EDC did not fire to destroy. That was the standing order. And it was the result of a great deal of careful thought by people who understood that the goal was not victory over the Vethkai, but the establishment of a precedent. You did not want to destroy 12 ships and create 12 martyrs and give the Council a justification for something far worse. You wanted to demonstrate, with absolute precision, that you could destroy 12 ships, and you chose not to, and that choice was itself a statement. The first salvo crippled the lead vessel's broadcast array, clean, precise, no damage to anything else. The second salvo took out the propulsion systems of 3 flanking ships simultaneously. The third salvo, which came 11 seconds after the first, disabled the primary weapons systems of 2 more vessels, neither of which had managed to fire a single shot. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, the Ardmore group reduced a 12-ship administrative fleet to a collection of stationary vessels with limited communications and no forward capability. No lives lost, no fires, no catastrophic damage. Just quiet, professional, overwhelming precision. Orvith sent an emergency transmission to the Council. I was already in the session chamber when the transmission came in. I had walked there quickly when the first alert confirmed engagement. I had taken my seat at the back, at the flickering desk, with my translation receiver in my ear, and I sat very still. Aerith received the transmission with visible alarm. Several other delegates received it at the same moment, through their own channels, and the chamber was suddenly full of the particular kind of noise that large rooms make when many beings are alarmed simultaneously. Aerith looked across the chamber at me. I met his gaze steadily. He said, through the translation network, "What has Earth done?" "Earth," I said, "has defended itself." He stared at me for a long moment. The copper color of his eyes caught the chamber light. I saw something in his expression that I had not seen before in all my weeks at the Concord Ring. It was not anger. It was not outrage. It was something more interesting and more significant than either of those. It was the first trace of uncertainty. "This is an act of aggression against a council-sanctioned operation," he said. "No," I said. "This is a lawful response to an unauthorized incursion into sovereign territory. The legal argument is in the document we filed this morning. You have a copy. The council archive has a copy. Every member of this chamber has a copy." Oliver had ensured that. Every delegate had received the Declaration of Sovereign Integrity at the start of the session. Many of them were looking at their tablets now, reading it. Some of them had been reading it for hours. The chamber was very loud and very confused for a long time after that. I sat at my desk and I answered every question that was put to me with the same level voice, the same precise references, the same complete and unshakable calm. Adeze had her ships. The Vethkai fleet was stationary. The document was in the archive. And something else was happening, something I had not been certain would happen, but had quietly hoped for. 3 separate delegates, from 3 separate species, had sent discreet messages to my personal device during the chaos. 2 of them said variations of the same thing. "We would like to speak privately." The 3rd message was from a delegate named Councillor Petra Lund of the Servani people, a small, careful species from a binary star system who had been on the wrong side of Vethkai policy for 60 years, and who had been watching the session with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time to see something, and is very deliberately not letting their face show how much it matters to them. Councillor Lund's message was 4 words: "We are paying attention." I read that message once, put the device back in my pocket, and returned my attention to the chamber, where Aerith was still speaking and the noise was still enormous, and 31 species were struggling to understand what had just happened. I understood it. I had understood it before it happened. This was not an act of desperation. It was not the frightened response of a cornered species. It was the calculated, prepared, precisely timed action of a people who had spent the entirety of their existence learning to turn disadvantage into leverage. We had drawn a line, not in anger, not in fear, in absolute, considered certainty. And for the first time since I had walked into the Concord ring and found my seat at the back of the room, the chamber felt different. The weight of it was different. The air was different. Something had shifted. Outside the great viewport above the chamber floor, the stars were the same as they had always been, indifferent, cold, brilliant. But I looked at them now and thought, we belong out there, not as observers, not as a curiosity, not as something to be managed or guided or gently mocked in cultural broadcasts, as ourselves. And we were going to make absolutely certain that every species in that room understood that, not through speeches, not through protests, filed, in folders that no one opened, but through the same language the universe had always used to teach the most important lessons, the language of undeniable fact. The Vethkai fleet was stationary in our solar system. The document was in the archive. The Ardmore group was in position. And I was sitting at my desk at the back of the room, completely calm, translation receiver in my ear, notebook open on my lap, writing down everything, just as I had on the first day. But now they knew I was writing. The council chamber had not been silent like this in living memory. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of 31 species with things to say, none of them brave enough to be first. I let it last exactly 90 seconds, the same time they had always given me to speak. Then I stood up. "I have a request," I said. Every head in the room turned toward the back row, toward the flickering desk, toward the man from Earth who had spent weeks being politely, systematically ignored. "I am requesting an emergency plenary session, full attendance, all voting members. I am submitting a formal proposal for revision to the Council's foundational charter." Aerith said precisely, "Observer status does not confer the right to table legislation." "No," I agreed, "it does not, which is why I will not be tabling it. Councillor Petra Lund of the Sorvani delegation will be tabling it, and Councillors Yemi Dara of the Arathi people and Owen Hale of the Tyran Collective will be co-sponsoring it. I have their written authorizations here." I held up 3 documents. Oliver had printed them that morning. He was very good at printing things at the right moment. The silence had a different texture now. Arath looked at Lund. Lund looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had been composing that look for 60 years. The plenary session was convened the following morning. I had not slept. There was too much to do, and I was not the kind of person who slept when there was work. Oliver had gone to his quarters at midnight, and I had told him to actually sleep, because I needed him sharp, and he had gone reluctantly. And I had worked through the dark hours at the back of the chamber, using the terminal at my desk, the flickering screen casting pale light across my notes. What I wrote that night was not a speech, it was a record, 40,000 words. Every session I had attended, every vote, every procedural maneuver that had been used to keep Earth silent and powerless, every impact of the Resource Partitioning Act on our access to the systems we had found. The story of the stewardship protocol, beginning with its drafting and ending with 12 disabled ships in our solar system. I did not write it with anger. I wrote it the way a surveyor writes a survey, methodically, accurately, without embellishment. At 4 in the morning, I completed it and formatted it into a clean document. Then I distributed it to every delegate in the chamber. Every single one, with a cover note that said, simply, "This is the record of Earth's experience in the Galactic Council. It is presented for review without editorial comment." No one slept much that night. I know this because of the read receipts that came back to my device in the small hours, one after another, each one telling me that another delegate had opened the document. By 6 in the morning, every delegate had read it. The plenary session began at 9. The proposal that Councillor Lund tabled was called the Sovereign Integrity Amendment. Its language was precise and its scope was carefully limited. It addressed 3 things. First, no species with observer or full member status could be classified as a protectorate without the explicit written consent of that species' sovereign government. This was the core. This was the Earth Clause, though no one called it that officially. Not yet. Second, discovery records filed with the Council Registry would carry enforceable priority rights, subject to a review period during which the discovering species had standing to contest conflicting claims. Third, all Council member species, regardless of tier classification, would be allocated a minimum voting share on any legislation directly affecting their territory, sovereignty, or species designation. These were not radical demands. They were not triumphant declarations. They were corrections. The quiet, careful corrections of a system that had been built by the powerful for the powerful, and had never quite gotten around to noticing the problem with that. The debate lasted 7 hours. There were speeches, some hostile, mostly from Vethkai-aligned delegates who framed the amendment as a destabilizing overreach. Some cautious, from species who wanted the change but were not yet willing to commit. And some, from delegates I had not expected, who spoke with a directness that surprised even me. A councillor named Grace Osi from the Tambari people, who had been quiet for every session I had attended, stood and said that the record I had distributed that morning was not a novelty. It was a pattern, and she had seen this pattern before, and her people had been on the receiving end of it, and she was supporting the amendment without reservation. When she sat down, there was a quality to the silence that was entirely different from the silence that had greeted me on my first day. I thought about what Oliver had said to me after the first session. When we had walked back from the administrative office, where the clerk had told us about the committee that had not met in 47 years, Oliver had said quietly, "Maybe we were never supposed to get anywhere here." I had told him then that I did not believe in supposed to. The vote was called, 22 in favor, 9 against, 0 abstentions. The Sovereign Integrity Amendment passed. I did not stand. I did not raise my hands. I looked straight ahead at the central floor, and I felt the vote land in my chest like something settling back into its right place. And I let it settle, and I breathed, and I sat very still, while the chamber moved into the administrative work of recording the result, and updating the charter, and filing the procedural notifications. Sitting beside me said nothing for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "The committee meets." I looked at him. "Non-voting observer grievances, Tier 0, he said. "It will have to convene now, to process the reclassification, since we're not Tier 0 anymore." He was right. The amendment included a transitional clause. With full voting rights and the discovery provisions in place, Earth's observer classification was immediately superseded. We were, effective from the vote, a full council member. I looked at the desk, the flickering panels, the support pillar behind us, the cooling duct still humming at its same low frequency. I thought, we are not moving to the front row today. That would be the kind of symbolic gesture that looked good in broadcasts and meant very little in practice. What mattered was the work. And there was so much work still to do. The Resource Partitioning Act needed to be reviewed under the new discovery provisions. Earth's defense treaties needed to be formalized. The 3 species who had supported us quietly would need careful, reciprocal engagement, because their trust was a resource, and you did not waste resources. The Vethkai relationship needed to be rebuilt, not warmly, not quickly, but honestly, because a galaxy in which Earth and the Vethkai were permanent adversaries was a worse galaxy than one in which they were difficult but functioning neighbors. None of that was easy. None of it would be fast. I picked up my notebook and turned to a clean page. At the top, I wrote the date. Then I wrote a single line. Start from where we are. The plenary session closed. The delegates began to file out. A few stopped at our desk on their way. Councillor Lund paused and gave me a long, measured look and a small nod, which I returned. Councillor Osi said, simply, "Long overdue," and kept walking. Councillor Owen Hale, who was a tall, sparse being with pale coloring in careful hands, stopped and looked at the flickering display panels on our desk and said, "We can get those fixed." "Thank you," I said. He nodded and left. After the chamber emptied, I stayed. Oliver asked if I was coming and I told him to go ahead. I would follow in a little while. He went, and I was alone in the room, and I walked down the tiers from the back row, all the way to the central floor, and I stood there. I had watched this floor from the back for weeks. I had watched Arath stand here, watched others stand here, watched the light catch the inlaid symbols of every council species in the floor's design. I looked at them now, close up. 41 species, 41 histories, 41 different ways of making it to this room. I looked up. The great viewport above the chamber was enormous, a sweeping arc of transparent material that showed the stars in their full, unfiltered brightness. Thousands of them, millions. Old light from old fires, crossing distances that made every human ambition look small and every human problem look smaller. I looked at them for a long time. I thought about my father at the edge of the water, pointing at the rocks, asking me what had made those shapes. Pressure, I had said. Time, he had said. And the ocean never stopping. We had not stopped. Not once, in all the centuries that had made us. Not through the ice or the fire, or the long, difficult work of learning to live alongside ourselves. Not through the first cold years of reaching into space and finding it vast and dark, and full of things we did not understand. Not through the indignity of the back row, and the flickering panels, and the laughter that had rolled through a great chamber while two humans sat behind a desk that no one had bothered to maintain. Not ever. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a small object. I had carried it since I left Earth. It was a fragment of dark rock, uneven, about the size of my fist, mounted in a simple glass case. My grandmother had been a geologist. She had worked on a research project studying impact craters in her country, tracking the evidence of ancient asteroid strikes. She had kept a fragment from one site in a glass case on her desk for 40 years. When I told her I was going to represent Earth in the Galactic Council, she had pressed the case into my hands without a word. I held it now in the light of the chamber. Old rock, rock that had fallen from the sky, from somewhere beyond our world, and hit our ground with enough force to reshape the landscape. And the landscape had absorbed it. The planet had continued. Life had continued. We had continued. I set the glass case down on the edge of the central floor and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up, put it back in my pocket, and turned toward the exit. There was a transmission waiting for me from Nadia. There was a briefing from Adeze. There was a meeting with Councillor Lund's office scheduled for the afternoon, and another with Owen Hale's team in the evening, and a long list of procedural items that needed attention now that Earth's status had changed. The stars would still be there tonight. They had been there before we arrived, and they would be there after every problem on that list was resolved. And they were patient in the way that only ancient things are patient. But we were patient too. We had always been patient. We just had better things to do than show it. I walked out of the chamber. I walked down the long corridor with its soft white lights and its pine-scented air. I walked past the administrative office where a clerk had once told me that a committee had not met in 47 years. I did not stop. I had work to do. And for the first time since I had walked into the Concord Ring and found a flickering desk at the back of the room, I walked through that corridor with the particular kind of forward momentum that belongs only to people who know exactly where they are going, not because the road was easy, because they had already survived every version of hard, and they had learned, over a very long time, that surviving was just the beginning.